Welcome to CIVILNET. Today we're joined by Dr. Laurence Broers. Dr. Broers is the Caucasian Program Director at the London-based peacebuilding organization, Conciliation Resources. Furthermore, he is an Associate Fellow at Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program. He investigates conflicts and peace processes in the South Caucasus, de facto and unrecognized states, and Armenian and Azerbaijani relations and politics. Dr. Broers, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So you authored a new book entitled Armenia and Azerbaijan, Anatomy of a Rivalry, which you presented to the Armenian public. Why do you refer to it as a rivalry as opposed to a conflict or a confrontation? And what is new in this book with regards to the Nagorno-Karabakh peace settlement?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto CIVILNET. It's always a pleasure to be here. Yes, indeed, I've just published this new volume, Anatomy of a Rivalry. In terms of its contribution, the book is focused very much on the 25 years, slightly more than 25 years now, since the ceasefire. It distinguishes between three different phenomena: conflict, violence, and rivalry, and tries to provide explanations for at these different levels. So what I mean by rivalry is a long-term embedded antagonism between two states that lasts decades and is punctuated by regular militarized crises. And so the main argument of the book is that this describes the situation that exists between Armenia and Azerbaijan today, and therefore is an extrapolation, an extension of analysis of the conflict into the present day, with a focus on long-term strategic processes that embed the rivalry across these two states. And with that said, it also contributes a study of politics and the dynamics in the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. You might be aware my previous work is focused very much on de facto states, and so this book is very far from suggesting that Armenia and Azerbaijan are the only actors relevant in the conflict today. One level of analysis doesn't exclude the other.
Recently, the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers met in Geneva and released a joint statement. And the meeting lasts for over 2 days. You described this as reflecting the seriousness of the current moment in the peace process. What did you mean by that? And why was this different from previous joint statements?
Well, I referred to it in terms of the seriousness of the moment because it's more than a year since the reported agreement of the two foreign ministers on the necessity of preparing populations for peace. And over that time, we haven't seen very much movement in that direction. There has been the journalistic exchange, which happened last year, but beyond that, we're in a kind of a limbo. And I think it's very important to move forward and to start to conceptualize and advocate for a framework within which the more substantive political discussions can take place. With that said, there are a number of previous agreements that haven't been fulfilled. So I think it's a very important moment to move forward with some incremental steps, increasing trust, giving some more texture to this peace process. I see that really as a quite urgent matter, hence my reference to the seriousness of the moment. And it was, I think, interesting to see the emphasis on the amount of time that the talks went on. They do appear to have been quite substantive, so that's encouraging.
According to the Armenian Foreign Ministry, the Armenian Foreign Minister also pushed for the future participation of Nagorno-Karabakh authorities in peace negotiations. How realistic is this prospect, bearing in mind Azerbaijan's reluctance, and what would it change about the peace talks?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the de facto authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh did participate previously in the peace talks in the 1990s. There was a much more comprehensive framework at that time for the talks. And I think at a logical level, the root cause of the conflict is the political status of Nagorno-Karabakh, and therefore any peace process that is aiming to resolve that status is quite dysfunctional without the participation of those whose political identity is at stake. So it is difficult to imagine at this stage what that would look like. But ultimately, I think for this peace process to move forward, to generate solutions and approaches to a number of key conflict issues, the parameters of participation do need to be increased quite substantially.
So, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has stated multiple times that he thinks any conflict resolution must be acceptable to the peoples of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as Azerbaijan. Do you think this is significant? And what do you think this would change about the peace process if Azerbaijan also took this approach?
I think it's significant in terms of an attempt to alter the mood music and the character of the rhetoric around the peace process. But ultimately we do need to move on from that kind of positive messaging into more concrete steps. The danger with that kind of positive messaging on its own is that it can start with time to look like rather empty sort of friendship of peoples, Soviet-style positive branding. It needs to come in tandem with concrete steps that indicate a willingness to move forward. And there are a number of different measures that could be undertaken. The sides have already agreed to some limited humanitarian cooperation, but there are many more things that could be done that would give meaning to such statements and give them a basis in a multi-track process that is moving forward.
Legislative elections are due in Azerbaijan. Do you think these elections will have an impact on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue? And to what extent is the Nagorno-Karabakh issue represented in the political divide in Azerbaijan?
Well, I think the conflict has been very much reflected in the political divide over the last few decades since the conflict in Azerbaijan, simply by virtue of the fact that it is the more nationalist opposition that is challenging the regime in Azerbaijan. You have that sort of post-Soviet nationalist contrast between government and opposition in Azerbaijan. So in that sense, I think the conflict has been quite embedded. How significant these elections are, in my book I argue for distinguishing between formal and informal domains of political power, both in Azerbaijan and in Armenia prior to the Velvet Revolution. And I think we have been seeing quite significant change in both dimensions. We've seen a number of high-ranking officials, very long-standing officials, have been relieved of their duties. In Azerbaijan, we're seeing now parliamentary elections. We've also seen a regrouping and change in terms of the dominance of informal factions, particularly with the faction associated with the Pashinyan family becoming more influential in Azerbaijan. But I think the real revolutionary change, the significant change would come when these two domains, the distance between them is narrowed and the constitutional order becomes the primary map of political power in the country. Presidential and parliamentary elections are also due in Nagorno-Karabakh on March the 31st. Do you think a change in government in Nagorno-Karabakh would have an impact on the peace talks going on? And but at the same time, perhaps, is Stepan Akert so removed from the negotiating table that it's unrealistic to expect it to have much of an impact? No, I think we need to distinguish between the impact of these elections in terms of the peace process and in terms of domestic politics in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think primarily, they are important in terms of legitimating government and providing a mandate for government inside Nagorno-Karabakh for the population that lives there. So that I would see as the primary significance. One of the points that I've argued in my work and is argued in this book is that elections in unrecognized states matter for the domestic legitimacy of the authorities that are in government in such territories. And by that very token, their mandate, their legitimacy also affects the quality of their voice on peace process issues. So that is how I would see that connecting at this stage.
Do you think that Nagorno-Karabakh's participation in the peace process may in fact allow for a sharing of the burden or the responsibility between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh with regards to compromise or a possible compromise? I think the question is that if there is to be a compromise, surely Nagorno-Karabakh authorities have to be involved in the decision-making or in the process for that compromise to materialize.
Yeah, I think there's been a stereotype circulating for a long time prior to 2018 that Yerevan could deliver Stepanakert in any peace agreement, which I think was always a very questionable assumption. And in that sense, I think the election of legitimate government authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh and their participation in the peace process does indeed challenge that stereotype and potentially make a compromise more, whatever solution emerges, more viable. If compromise is the route to a peace agreement, then it has to be something that is shared by everyone involved, and most of all by those who are most affected by the conflict. And that, in the current situation, is those who are living in Nagorno-Karabakh today, and those who are displaced from the territories around, those who are living today in those territories. So in a sense, yes, one needs a much more complex, rounded process in which all of these different constituencies and populations are able to have a voice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Broers.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today at CIVILNET.